thanks for joining us this morning. We're going to have a really interesting conversation. Those of you who are looking for clues as to why Bill Clinton met Loretta Lynch at the airport this week, you're at the wrong session. That's being explained elsewhere. But we're going to talk a little bit about the state of the world and how finance can be brought to bear to make it a better place. I'd like to set a little context before we begin. My name is Brett Jenks. I'm the president and CEO of RARE. RARE is a global conservation organization whose mission is to inspire change so people and nature thrive. And I think that's a fitting mission for an ideas festival where whether you're learning yoga or how to speak Chinese or how to understand the political landscape, we're all looking to be inspired so that we can just thrive a little more effectively each day. When you look out at the global landscape and you think about the state of the planet, it's easy to start listing off the many challenges, the ones you've read about in the last week in the newspaper, whether it's Brexit and uncertainty about a post-war Europe, whether it's a migration crisis, whether it's the stagnating growth of the middle class and this growing gap and poverty. Pick your poison. There's enough to be worried about around the world. I think when you step back, though, and begin to think about the most pressing matters long term, it's clear, maybe I'm biased, that the environment is a really significant challenge. In fact, if we assume that our cultures, our society, and in fact our economies are really dependent upon the natural landscapes of this planet, then I think it's pretty clear that we can make the case that the environment is perhaps the most pressing issue facing humanity, even if it's not covered that way day to day on the cover of the New York Times. What's amazing, though, is the progress that we've been making. And so to create a little bit of a context for this conversation, we've made some extraordinary progress as a species just in the last 12 months. If you consider two major decisions, the hundreds of governments have gotten together to make. One is the Paris Accord, where we've literally decided to try to set a temperature threshold for the planet. Imagine even talking about that years ago. Galileo was considered a heretic because he said the sun was the center of our solar system. Imagine what they would have done to climate engineers who said we're going to establish a thermostat for the planet and literally manage it. Or consider what are called the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 goals that hundreds of nations have agreed to commit to create the sustainable planet on which we want to live. These are the kinds of decisions that would have been unfathomable decades ago, generations ago. As you think about Brexit and what it means in terms of a post-World War II peace creation and assurance mechanism, think about the planets, the countries of the world committing to a way to inhabit our planet. A really big deal. And I'm fortunate enough to have with me today on this panel two people who know a great deal about all of the above. We thought about when we read finally the name of this panel, we were a little surprised because we thought, well, economic collapse and climate change, certainly there's a link there. We also thought about maybe titling it, an environmentalist, a world banker, and a hedge fund guy walk into a bar. But in the end, we said, well, let's just get started with the panel, and that's what we're going to do right now. So, David, I'm going to start with you by way of both introduction and then a question. So David is a new friend and kind of an emerging hero of mine, and I'll tell you why. This guy's a West Point grad, an Army Ranger. He did a number of tech startups, and then he decided it was time to serve his country in a new way. He worked for W in the White House, and when Hank Paulson, who's a mentor of mine, decided to become Treasury Secretary, was asked to become Treasury Secretary and accepted, one of the first things he said was, I'd like W's Sherpa, David, to come work for me as Undersecretary of Treasury. So he served in a really critical time in our nation's history within the Treasury Department, and then later became the president of Bridgewater, arguably, I think, the largest hedge fund in the world. So At a very young age, having accomplished all of this, now being a member of the Aspen Institute board, I know you've thought a little bit, at least, I'm sure a lot, about this transition from, that Aspen likes to talk about, from success in your life to significance in the world. Given that backdrop, this environmental challenge we face, and your background, how does that affect you? How do you think about the world?
Great. Well, thanks all of you for coming. Nice to be here. Well, Bob Steele and I were in the Treasury Department with Hank during that financial crisis, and that was really, for me, a kind of a moment that brought together a lot of things. The Aspen Institute, not to be too corny about it, but the Aspen Institute had been an important part of helping me make the decision. I was involved with the fellowship here in 2003 to help me make the decision to move into public service. So when I went into public service in 2005, the Aspen experience had been part of it in terms of trying to think about taking on a responsibility and contributing in a way just beyond my business career up until that point. And so I had this amazing moment where I was in the Treasury at a really unique time and feeling the weight of that responsibility and the humility that comes with knowing that people are sort of counting on you to do something that goes well beyond yourself. And so that was the first sort of awakening, I think. And then the second was really, Bob and I had the privilege of really working with Hank. And when it comes to the environment, Hank Paulson is really a pretty special role model because he didn't sort of wake up at a point in his life where he had been very successful and make the environment a priority. It had been something that he had integrated into his life, into his family, into his philanthropy, into everything that he had done. And so when he came in as Treasury Secretary, and this was before we were aware that a financial crisis was coming, he made the environment a real priority. We established a new office. We had a whole agenda, which in some ways was overcome by the financial crisis, but the environment was at the forefront of his agenda in the early days, and that was really an inspiring opportunity for me. And so that really got me on a path where I became much more engaged in those things.
Didn't you say at one point that Hank really thought nothing was going to be happening in Treasury?
Yeah, well, when he first showed up, he certainly was worried that he wouldn't have an opportunity to really have a legacy and agenda that would be worthy of him sort of investing the energy that he was going to invest in. And as it turned out, there was lots of opportunity, but not in the way that he had imagined.
Best laid plans. So, Paula, you're a senior leader in the World Bank. I like to describe Paula as the head of environment for the World Bank, one of the most important institutions in many ways on the planet. But you're also famous for being arguably the mother of the Sustainable Development Goals. So tell us what the SDGs are, and then most importantly, how are we actually going to achieve them?
Well, thank you, and thanks to everybody. I'll echo David for joining us today. Look, the SDGs arose from a sense that what you measure matters, and that the previous incarnation of a global metric, the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, had brought around huge change. So the SDGs were based on the assumption that we need to have a more comprehensive understanding of what development is, of what are the different facets, the different sectors, the different issues that are embedded and that need to be linked up together in order to deliver long-term growth that is both sustainable and inclusive, that it really does leave no one behind. And what the SDGs do is highlight some of the key areas that need to be intervened, that need to be developed in order to deliver on those long-term growth trajectories. But more importantly, they evidence the linkages and the synergies between the different sectors. And if we can manage those trade-offs, if we can manage and identify where the win-win opportunities in a really intelligent and proactive way, we can actually change the course of development. We can actually move out of this space where we're in right now with a very complicated set of indicators around the world that you described very well, Brett, at the beginning, for change. So it's not just what they're about, these 17 goals and all the associated targets, but it's about the how. And let me give you an example. When I was advocating for this, for global adoption of this, I would give examples of, for example, child malnutrition. If you have a target of child malnutrition in a government and it's just seen as something standalone that one given agency is responsible for, it's a marginal target. But if it becomes a whole of government target, whole of society, and you start to really understand this is the foundation of my social capital, of my human capital for the future. This is the basis of my competitiveness, of my productivity, of who I am as a country. Child malnutrition all of a sudden becomes something different, and then it becomes the purview of the Ministry of Agriculture and of Education and of Trade and Competitiveness. It changes completely, and that target, which used to be standalone, becomes hugely transformative. And you can say the same thing about water use efficiency, or just a whole array of targets that are not new, but how we do it is new. And who we do it with is equally important. I think it's really telling, and I'm delighted to be on a panel with the two of you, because that's what it's going to take to deliver on this agenda. Governments alone can't do it. The World Bank alone can't do it. It will take really coalitions of willing partners to be able to move forward on this. And I really want to say that one of the aspects that we have to remember about the SDGs is, as I said at the beginning, that sustainability has to be very much about inclusion, about ensuring that everybody can be both participating in the implementation of the SDGs, but also benefiting from them. I think that would be the hallmark of success.
So it's interesting to think about David coming from Treasury and now working in a hedge fund with sovereign. So you've worked with finance ministers for many, many years, and now with sovereign funds, advising them. Paula, at the World Bank, your major initiatives, social, environmental initiatives inside the World Bank, are funded by the treasuries of a number of these nations. So there's a much closer linkage than most people recognize. And just to underscore your point about the need for these kinds of institutions to get aligned around some of these big objectives. Absolutely. Otherwise, this never gets done. So, David, take us back to your time in Treasury when it seemed for a while financial Armageddon was upon us. You were asked, you and Hank and Bob Steele were asked to figure out how to save the planet economically, at least. And I know you guys never slept and learned a great deal about what it would take you had to make some unpopular choices to right the ship. What did you learn fixing a financial system that you think we could be using to address some of these environmental challenges?
Good, thanks. Well, in preparation for this, I went back to, as Brett said, I had worked in the White House, and I had worked with the president on the G8 summit, and it was in Heiglandam in 2007. And I don't know if any of you follow these things. There's a whole world around these summits, but what happens is you negotiate these huge documents, I don't know, 15, 20 pages, something like that, of the agenda that the leaders of the world essentially agree on. Some of those are measured, many of them are measured, and it's a very significant undertaking because you, at a minimum, then have to revisit that next year and the year after. Hey, did you do what you said? And what was striking about it when I went back and reviewed it, so this was 9 years ago, June of 2007, was how much the environment was viewed along the lines of what we said is a central issue for food security, for social justice, for economic vitality. It was a real centerpiece of that negotiation, and it was laying out all the challenges. So there was a fairly good diagnosis of the challenges. There were lots of commitments of things that should be explored and so forth. So to make the comparison, very different from the financial crisis in the sense that this is something that even 9 years ago was identified as critical to the future of the planet across lots of different dimensions. And when you fast forward it to today, and I was thinking about what I'm learning from Brett, but also just knowing what's occurred with the benefit of those 9 years, it's sort of a tale of two cities. There's been incredible progress. If you look on the policy front, there's an enormous amount of progress. If you look on the investing front and the way that capital is now being deployed and sustainability becoming a significant focus to major global capital flows, very significant. The degree to which the environment is viewed within the context of other dimensions of policy and integrated into economic policy as a finance minister priority, more so now than ever. Really significant, and yet, so that's the beauty of what's occurred. And on the other hand, the gap between where we are and what is still required is enormous, particularly in matching private capital, which I think across all dimensions of the political spectrum, people agree that the private sector and private capital is going to be necessary to make some of these fundamental changes. The match between that private capital and the opportunity is still very, very limited relative to what's required. And so enormous progress, but an enormous challenge that lies ahead. And part of addressing that challenge is some of the same things, to go back to your question on the financial crisis, is transparency and governance, clarity around metrics and accountability. Those basic fundamental things that make a successful financial system work, and what failed us in 2008 are going to be many of the same things that are going to be required for this next phase of focused policy, private, public sector, philanthropic partnership to address some of these core challenges. We can talk a little bit more about what that means, but that's sort of the main takeaway as I think and compare the two.
I think it leads to a whole number of range of conversations related to the emergence of ESGs and screens in the investment field, to the growth of impact investing and the potential for private citizens to use not just their philanthropy, but also their wealth to make investments to advance certain changes that we all know that are needed. But let's stick with, you mentioned finance ministers. Let's stick with that theme for a second. So I have a friend who was environment minister of Costa Rica, country I absolutely love. And I asked him when he was, his team had gone out of office, his party was running again for office, and I said, so are you going to be, what do you think? Are you going to be environment minister again? And he said, oh, no. I've learned a lot. If I'm going to save the environment of Costa Rica, I want to be finance minister, because that's the guy I was begging for funding for in order to get anything done. So Paula, talk about the role of finance ministers and how that's changed in recent years. What do we need finance ministers to recognize in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals?
That's a good question, Red, and I'd really kick off from what David was saying about the two cities and the progress we've made, but where we are. I think that finance ministers are increasingly understanding that long-term growth cannot be sustained until and unless we manage our natural capital, natural assets, it's the forest, the fish, the water, the soil, in a sustainable way. And there's a growing understanding, I think, that conventional measures of growth, like GDP, are really very misleading, because a country can grow over the short term by running down its natural capital, but that kind of growth cannot be, forget about sustainable, it can't be sustained. So GDP is not telling us whether the growth can be sustained, and it's not telling us about how natural capital is being depleted. And sometimes you have what I call the myth of renewables, right? You think that everything's renewable until you run it down past a certain point of degradation that it's not. And there's a growing understanding of that. And I want to say, speaking to your Costa Rica example, I was actually there 3 weeks ago. And we launched an initiative on natural capital valuation. And I didn't launch it with the Minister of Environment. It was launched by the Minister of Finance with the central bank, because Costa Rica is showing great leadership and really understanding that you have to have a good valuation of natural capital in order to understand what your long-term trajectory can be, and to embed that valuation of your natural capital into national accounts. So increasingly what you're seeing is that there's a sense of recognition that if you can have a valuation of environment and natural resources, that actually leads to better social and economic decisions for development. And if on top of that you factor in climate change, which is really bringing a lens on the fragility of a lot of these ecosystem services, water, soil, pollination, as well as the state of the natural resources. Think of all the fires that we're seeing right now in the forest sector. That can really focus the mind on the fact that climate change, unless we really look at the underlying robustness of the natural capital, can be very, very fragile. And it's not just about future growth. It's also the fact that a lot of the development gains that many countries have made over the last 30 years, the huge amount of effort, could be wiped out or undermined. So I would really echo what David said. We've made amazing progress, but we're at this critical juncture right now where we need the likes of everybody in this room to really band together, come together, and have the ambition and the intent for change.
So it's interesting, you thinking about people banding together and trying to, I'd like us to I think you can end up talking a lot. We can all end up talking a lot about the big picture, and finance ministers, a call to action from the environment minister, this big broad topic of impact investing. But we had a working group this week trying to figure out how to invest private capital in small-scale fisheries in order to address this global challenge that I know you're both familiar with and at some point we should be talking about. And it was sort of your classic impact investing, boring conversation. People wanting to define, as Warren Buffett says, is it a? I don't like impact investing, he says, because it's like a houseboat. It's not a house and it's not a boat, and I don't see why you would buy one. But once you get down to an actual deal, the whole group we were working with got almost ravenous about the details and the impacts, what it could do for a fishing community, what it could do for the country, how you might stack capital, how you might bring the capital to bear. So what's an example, maybe we could even use that one, what's an example of an SDG, what's number 14 is oceans. So saving the oceans, ending overfishing, what would each of these groups that we're describing be able to bring to bear to actually do something about that?
Well, it's sort of stepping back. There's I made this point earlier, but there's this enormous change in the trajectory of global capital in terms of having sustainability as a greater focus. Trillions of dollars are now being allocated with sustainability being factored in. But what that actually means is very diffuse and varies a lot across what that capital, how that capital is deployed. And the ways that that's being deployed is changing a lot too in terms of what that means. And there's an entire continuum on one end where you're having negative policy decisions where you're not investing in X because it's not consistent with the overall investment thesis, to the more along the lines of what you're saying, which is much more creative, impact-like investing, which is essentially, I would define as having a set of social or policy goals that go beyond just a return on investment, but still very much seeking a market return, which is very measurable, and being able to introduce private capital into that mix. And the one that you and I have worked together a bit on is the small-scale fisheries, which is not small scale in terms of its significance to the planet. So there's a billion people that are dependent on these small-scale fisheries for their livelihood, for their economic vitality, for their protein. And that's an example that I've learned through Brett of where you have this combination of fisheries management combined with local engagement, combined with private capital, combined with rigor and accountability. And when those things come together, the results have been fabulous in terms of increasing productivity of the fisheries, increasing income of the fishermen, increasing the economic output of the regions. And but that's an area that to scale it requires this unique blending of public finance, private capital, and philanthropy. And the reasons for that are, in this unique example, are the same as the reasons that there's that huge gap that I mentioned earlier, because the risk reward isn't sufficient in many of these markets to generate the private investment. It's because there aren't regulatory or legal frameworks that protect investors. There's not capability on the ground. It takes a lot of knowledge and specificity to figure out how to invest in this particular case, but also to invest in similar cases. And so this is the kind of innovation that's going to be required to close that gap, that enormous gap that I mentioned earlier. And there's lots of different ways that might happen. There's a lot of people that I had a chance to meet last night that know a lot more about that than I do. But what I'm pretty certain about is the size of that gap, and that type of innovation is what's going to be necessary to close it. And the results from an economic standpoint, from even an investor standpoint, are quite compelling if you can kind of unlock or untie the knot that stood in the way of the private capital in the past.
So to that point, a lot of people would not know that, Paul, at the World Bank, you've probably got $1 billion investment fund just for fisheries. So if you take David's thesis, there's a solution that needs to be, where a country would benefit from scaling that solution across an entire nation, how would you think about the role of, what does the bank do other than lend capital? And to whom are they lending this capital in order to fix a chronic challenge like overfishing?
Well, I think that's one of the positive trends, to take your analogy, David, is that we're seeing in terms of fisheries, for example, a really incredible trend in terms of countries' appetite for borrowing money from the bank to tackle fisheries issues. So there's a growing understanding that fisheries is not some standalone sector, but really delivers on a huge array of factors that seem obvious but are oftentimes not taken up when countries or when different stakeholders think about fisheries. It delivers on the food security. It delivers on gender. Men fish, but the women process the fisheries. It delivers on job security. It delivers on safety nets. In many countries around the world, the fisheries is that social safety net. And I could go on. There's just so many. If you look across the board of all the SDGs, fisheries delivers on so many of them. So that understanding, I think, is also helping drive that increased appetite for the lending. What the bank does, obviously, is go in, and we provide a lot of technical assistance to government to help them better manage the fisheries, because you cannot have a good return on investment without healthy stocks. And many countries don't know what's out there. There's very little data. There's little monitoring. Data gaps are one, I think, of the biggest challenges. So countries need to create the institutions and the capacity to manage the fisheries, to understand it. And that's a huge part of the technical assistance that we bring. Also, how do you add value along the supply chain, right? If you take out the fish and you're losing 50% because you don't have a cooling facility, well, that seems like a pretty simple, low-hanging fruit to bring added value, so you can get more money for what you're fishing and hopefully also need to fish less. And how you can bring value along the entire supply chain of market access. So that's a big part of what we do. Another part of what we do, which speaks very much to what David was saying about sort of de-risking the sector to enhance and to encourage private sector investment, has to do with governance and governance reforms, right? Getting the right policies, the right regulations in place, so that this fisheries management is really embedded in a broader regime that enables a better management. There's a lot of other areas, illegal fishing and other spaces. It's a complicated space, but the bank is really delighted to see that our clients, governments, are really in an uptick in terms of understanding how much need there is and how much return on investment there is when you have a healthy fish stocks. And I would just end by saying that it's important when we talk about private sector that we're not just talking about big investors. To me, private sector is that small artisanal fisherman who just needs to look after his family's well-being. And that is really at the core of the work that we're doing in the bank.
So, may just
please.
To add to what Paula said, Brett and I have had this. There's sort of an awakening that's underway, but by no means fulfilled among finance ministers, not just in the area of fisheries, but in the area of environment more broadly, in terms of the core importance of that as part of that agenda. But that's evolving, that's developing, that's not been institutionalized. It varies by person, and so part of the necessity here is to help them understand that it's both advantageous from an economic standpoint, from a policy standpoint. It's also politically very advantageous for many of these finance ministers who in most cases are politicians, to take on that need and responsibility as a means for really addressing the challenges that their countries face, particularly as it relates to fisheries, particularly in the developing economies. The second thing is, when you talk about scaling this and really large-scale change, finance ministers are an important part of it, and the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IADB, they are a critical part of it, because if you think about the international system, there's not a lot of institutions that sit at the intersection of all those different pieces. The philanthropy, the private capital, the policymakers, like the World Bank does, like the IADB does. So the IFIs are a critical part of, once we've figured out these models and we're in the process of scaling them, the scaling is going to, by necessity, be dependent, I think, on these IFIs to take on an added leadership role, which is what Paula's all about, which is a really important piece of the puzzle.
And can I just add something really quickly there? I think something else that's really important is the fact that when you say going to scale, there's some fisheries that are coastal and are very much consigned to a coastal state, but most fisheries, fish move. So you really need regional approaches. When you talk about scaling up, you both need to ensure that you're working across nations, because you can work in one country, but if fishermen from another country are fishing illegally in those waters, you're going to undermine the whole edifice that you're trying to build up. So we have these massive regional programs where we're bringing entire coastlines up to speed in terms of sustainable fisheries management. And that's really important because it also opens up a huge opportunity for replication, not just scaling up, but replication of the kind of work that NGOs like RARE or many others around the world are doing in terms of how do you grapple with transitioning the small-scale fisheries into a more sustainable trajectory.
So we were talking this week about China and the fact that there are 200 million smallholder farmers in China, and a group of our colleagues launched an initiative to convert them from traditional cotton growing practices, where they're using way too many pesticides and absolutely contaminating the groundwater, the wetlands, affecting endangered species like the finless porpoise, calamitous environmental challenges just from the practice of growing traditional cotton. But to influence and change the behavior of 200 million smallholder Chinese farmers is not for the faint of heart. And so I think what we're actually talking about is just how difficult behavior change is. And it seems totally counterintuitive when you think about the fact that in order to, the village that would be required to make this change includes the World Bank. It includes private investors. It includes the local municipalities, the provincial leadership, the US Treasury. How do you, sitting in the World Bank, knowing what you have to deal with, trying to bring these folks together, knowing from my own experience in running an NGO, what is it that gives you hope that you can actually get these groups together to actually solve a problem as simple as how you plant your crop?
Well, look, we already have many projects that, first of all, are working across sectors, because when you talk about sustainable agriculture, it really is about bringing a lot of constituencies together. So we're doing really interesting work, for example, in cocoa, in Cote d'Ivoire, or in Ghana. We're doing really interesting work in Mozambique. And one of the really big changes there is that we're getting the ministries of environment and the ministries of agriculture together to do these projects together. So you're not looking just at the short-term productivity, which is oftentimes what the Ministry of Agriculture is pushing for. You're looking at the long-term productivity, right? How do you manage the water, the replenishment rates of the groundwater, et cetera, in a way that ensures that that productivity can be maintained and sustained over the longer term. So that's, from the bank's perspective, one of the key entry points. And then we're really bringing together the work that we're doing in the cocoa sector, working with private sector, because the private sector is increasingly, and not just from a philanthropic, let's do good, but really looking at the bottom line, at their long-term profits and sustainability, for example, of their supply chains, at sustainable sourcing. And you're seeing really interesting, many times, big companies thinking, we just can't wait to see where there's going to be produce that we can access that has been sustainably produced. We have to go to the ground and work with these producers to actually deliver and develop the sustainable sourcing from the ground up. So you see very big corporations starting to engage with these small holders and working to build up sustainable supply chains from the bottom up. And that's really a sea change. And what I've been seeing at the bank, we have these big gatherings twice a year. The most important is the annual meeting. I'm sure many of you will have heard about that. And there's these big powwows of all the ministers of finance, et cetera, et cetera. And what I've been seeing over the last meetings is that we're able to bring together ministers of finance and other key stakeholders, private sector, to sit around a table and talk about how we're going to tackle this together. So the bank has a huge role in de-risking, and the bank isn't just what's normally known as the World Bank, which is actually, the acronym is IBRD, but we also have another part of the bank, which is the International Finance Corporation, which works with private sector. So in Mozambique, we're doing work, for example, in the productive landscape, as I call it, And IFC is working with Port to Sell, which is a very big multinational, to look at sustainable plantations that will be generating some of the wood and pulp that's needed to feed the global market, working with local communities so that they become a part of the supply chain. So there's real innovation. I think there's real entrepreneurship. A lot more needs to be done. But again, I say the fact that we're sitting in this panel with such a huge array of stakeholders, this probably wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. So there's already a change in terms of different stakeholders coming together and figuring out where's the value added, and not just the value added from a short-term philanthropic perspective, but really where's the value added from a real understanding of the need to change these trajectories for everybody's future well-being.
So in a few minutes, we're going to hand this over to the audience and let you ask some questions and turn this in any direction that you want. But before we do that, we've had a couple conversations this week about impact investing, and it seems appropriate that if the World Bank can provide the kind of financing that would let a government, let's say like the Philippines, advance a governance model. This is wonky stuff, but a governance model, so the local fishermen, local fisheries can be self-managed and can begin to repopulate themselves. You know, what a lot of people don't know is if you measured the coastal fisheries like you do a tank of gas, we're at about a quarter tank globally right now. There's 1 billion people depending on those fisheries as their #1 source of protein, 1 billion of the world's poorest, most climate vulnerable people. So let's say there's a new model that empowers the fishermen to manage their own future. They're able to begin to recover their fisheries. That leads to a number of interesting opportunities for investment. And as Jeremy Grantham, one of our longtime board members at RARE said, you could probably make a lot of money eventually on the upside of fish recovery, especially once you figure out how to make that happen. So to impact investors, there's now potentially $50 billion out there looking for a pipeline of good, new, promising ideas that can actually have an impact, make the world a better place. And I'm not sure I would agree with David on the market return, full market return, but at least a return.
A market return.
A market return, which to be, we'll see how that all pans out. How do you, David, who've worked with now finance ministers, sovereign wealth funds, and then at Bridgewater with your clients, what have you seen that gives you hope or optimism around the potential for philanthropists who are also impact investors to help solve some of these problems?
Well, it was just the point I made earlier in the sense that I think there's two big trends. One big trend is a lot more capital is focused on sustainable investing, and so that's at the macro level, big global investors. It's been the case for the sovereign pension funds for many years, but you're now seeing the sovereign wealth funds make that transition, and so in big swaths of capital, now thinking about that is a key priority, combined with lots of innovation along the lines of what we've just talked about. So those two things are I think the sources of optimism, but the barriers to that investment are still very real along the lines of what I was describing. And so this is where you have to get from the theoretical statements in the G8 summits to very specific, narrow, simple ideas where you can, some of the guys that are in this room who are real impact investors can see the actual business model and how it's going to work, and how that capital, that first loss capital, whatever it is going to create a catalyst for bringing in more capital. And that's, I think that's what it's going to take. Those creative models that then become the basis for experimentation, success, and then scale. And so, the one we've worked on together is interesting because we now have a pilot that's actually shown real success. And so now we can make the case. But even if we make the case in that particular area and scale it 10 times over, that only addresses a small fraction of the problem. So I think those, let 1,000 flowers bloom kind of orientation around those experiments, and then ultimately those that are proven becoming the catalyst for more capital is the answer.
Yeah.
So questions, how else can we be helpful? Yes, I think we're going to pass around microphones, so just wait till you have a mic and then have at it.
Good morning. I'm Ridhima, sophomore at Yale, but I've been involved in some of the OWGs for the SDGs formation, the open working groups, and also the UN climate talks as a youth advisor to several countries. So the thing that worries me is that we have started overusing the term sustainability, and I think that concerns me a lot, especially as a young person. So what can we do to ensure that the SDGs, at least the sustainability part of the SDGs, is not mere rhetoric, and we actually work on those 169 targets and 17 goals? And sorry, one more question is that the poverty line has been shifted by the World Bank to $1.90, and that was after the SDGs were adopted in September 2015, which puts in more people below the poverty line. So I'm wondering how that also changes our approach towards the SDG implementation. Thank you.
Paula, you want to take this?
Sure. Look, I fully concur with the concern about the overuse of, I can think of a lot of words that we overuse. Sustainability is one of them, transformation, paradigm shift. I mean, there's a whole list of words that have stopped meaning anything. And I think the key there is to unpack, it's what I said at the beginning, to really, and to hold governments and to hold corporations, to hold academia, to hold everybody to account. Are you seeing the linkages and the trade-offs between these different targets? Because that's where the sustainability comes in. The sustainability isn't because you have an indicator or a target that's looking at water use efficiency. It's because you look at, okay, who's delivering on that? And if it's only an urban agenda, or if it's only an agricultural agenda, you're missing the boat. I mean, it has to be whole of system. So really, sustainability means that we tackle these from a comprehensive, more systemic way, which is really difficult because governments aren't set up that way, businesses, none of us, we're not, we're comfortable, our comfort zone is the opposite, it's the silos. So the sustainability is really, the proof in the pudding is in how we do it. It's what I was saying in the beginning, it's not just the what we do, it's the how we do it. And I think that that's where the revolution is really, the potential for that revolution lies. And we're going to have to be, all of us, looking and holding each other accountable, because that's the change from business as usual. And with regards to the second question, I have a rather unconventional take on the whole poverty angle. The Millennium Development Goals, which were the previous ones, delivered a lot, but not all of what we achieved globally in terms of poverty reduction was attributable to that. If you really want to reduce poverty, you can't go for these pro-poor minimalist approaches. That's why I think the whole of the SDGs will deliver on the poverty eradication, because you again need these whole of system approaches, not sort of, obviously you need to have some targeted policies that can pull specific groups of people out of extreme poverty, but you have to have a look across the whole SDGs. And if you deliver on the education, on water quality, for example, on very key issues, you're going to be able to have what is really called multidimensional poverty indexes that are not looking just at the income. As I was saying with GDP, I think it's misleading to look only at the income. Income is very relative. We need to use the SDGs to look at the poverty from a multidimensional angle. And then both the challenges, but particularly the opportunities for tackling poverty, are much richer and much more productive.
Well said. Yes, in the back.
Hi, my name is David Creasy. Appreciate what you're talking about. I think it's so very important, but frankly, I'm a bit surprised there's not a mention or discussion of what I would argue is the primary issue. And it's really the J-curve growth in population. So my question is really kind of negative, I guess, and I appreciate thoughts, is can we ever do enough? If we look out 20 years, 50 years, 100 years from now, and where the population most likely will be until it corrects at some point, but can we ever do enough to keep ahead of this?
Panelists?
I want to take that one. I have my thoughts, but
I don't know. I mean, it's an enormous challenge at both the macro level across all the dimensions of environmental resources and the depletion that we're dealing with, and in the narrow that we've been discussing with fisheries. So it's a matter of innovating as much as we can to address the issue at hand, and potentially creating scalable ways to deal with those knotty problems, but also recognizing the population is enormous, and you see that being the population growth is enormous, and you see that being very different across different parts of the world where in many parts of the developing world, as you know, it's tapering off, and in many parts of the developing world, it's growing in significant ways that are going to put added pressure on environmental degradation and everything else. So it's a conundrum. It doesn't in any way stand against or opposed to the kind of innovation we're talking about. That's part of the answer, but it may not be enough.
Well said, and to that I'll add that, you know, it's challenging because there's also, you have to look at it through different cultural lenses. You have the same conversation here, and probably if I were to say a show of hands, who thinks population growth should be curbed, a lot of hands will go up. You ask that same question in another continent, in a very different cultural setting, and you have the opposite reaction. So first of all, there's the cultural perspective that I think we have to be mindful of in order to address this. But the other is that still in many parts of the world that David was alluding to, part of the social safety net is to have children, right? So if we're able to increase the productivity of natural assets on where many of these poor people rely, whether it's the forest or the fisheries or productive landscapes, there's actually less of a, if you can call it I don't want to call it but an incentive to ensure that your social safety net is no longer reliant on having a lot of children. And I was just trying to remember, because I was this amazing panel on projects that are being undertaken in Lake Victoria. And I'm not going to get it exactly right, but they've seen these amazing linkages between fisheries management and the appetite of these communities to actually go for family planning. Because one, as the productivity goes up, then the women can spend more time processing the fish and adding value to the fish. And the men who were initially not so supportive of family planning are now seeing it as a bonus, because they are looking to have smaller families where they can actually grow the business with more participation of the whole family, including the women in the family. So that's a small cultural revolution. It's a huge behavioral revolution. And we have to start looking also at that kind of entry points and what are the drivers. But I agree with you, population growth is one of the big challenges together with climate change, you know, these big conundrums that we're going to have to tackle and to work around.
Really well said. I thought you were going to ask about climate. Yes, in the back.
So with COP21 in December, and then the Sustainable Development Goals, and then Habitat 3 coming up, could you kind of picture or imagine the idea of a large convergence of a lot of these major issues, and how that could create outcomes and then actually transformative change in those cities? We're involved a lot with the Habitat 3 and public spaces, placemaking, and how you create dramatic change. But all over the world, there are these activists who are change agents in those communities. And pairing them together with people who are COP21, global climate change, and then a lot of these sustainable issues. Sustainability is an outcome, like resilience is an outcome. Activation and place making is a way of creating change on many different levels.
Yeah, the question is, are those forces converging in a way that will be productive?
I mean, because I think converging, all of them will have a much bigger impact.
Yeah,
and would you agree with that? And maybe, is there a way
Could you imagine them converging?
Yeah. Well,
do a dialogue in Vancouver on convergence? And then there's a big foundation in Sweden that wants to do an international discussion around convergence, so that we're all together leading change and activation to create the outcomes you're talking about. We all need to do is together.
So let's just summarize it as could you envision one master plan and coming together to get it done?
You need it. I mean, I think ultimately implementation, do you want?
I'll say something.
The implementation of all of this is going to take place at national level, and I've said again and again and again that what countries agreed to in Paris, if I can use the acronym, is Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDC. So allow me to use that. That just means what countries pledged. The NDCs, if they had come without the SDGs having been adopted 3 months before, would, I think, have a very different value proposition than with the SDGs, because the SDGs have that comprehensive whole of system approach. So into that, you have to embed the NDCs. so that you can help countries work on these two agendas together. And that convergence is imperative. It's something we're thinking a lot about the bank, and many others are trying to sort of grapple with, because the dividends are huge. You have the same stakeholders at country level, and importantly at subnational level, the cities, the municipal authorities, they are going to have to implement these two agendas together. So the bank and others are trying to help them think through, what are the entry points, what are the synergies, where really is that low-hanging fruit, where are those sweet spots where you can deliver on both, on the energy, on the reforestation, on the sustainable urban development. There's all these agendas that of necessity should converge, but we need a lot of thought leaders. Aspen Institute, I would point to. We need private sector thinking about this. What does that really look like? Because it's easy to say, but actually unpacking it at national and subnational level is challenging. But I think that's one of the great opportunities we have in the coming years, is to make that convergence a reality.
Yes, I could imagine it, and I'm worried. I wanted to make this point earlier, a cautionary note. I'm worried that the progress that I was referring to earlier and that we've reflected in this conversation could be at risk, and we shouldn't take it for granted. And there's two forces, I think, that potentially could run counter. One is that we're, I think, arguably entering a period of very challenging global growth. We've been in a period, but we're entering potentially a new period of very challenging global growth, which is going to be very hard to generate significant return on assets. And so if you think about those sources of capital that we were talking about before in terms of more of a sustainability orientation within the public pension plans and so forth, those global investors are going to be more challenged than historically to generate returns that meet their national needs. So the by and large economic pressures that policymakers feel, I think, are likely to go up, not down, in the next decade. And then the second thing that could play into how all these things come together is the political fragmentation that we see happening around the world. So I'm not an expert on Paris as an example, but one wonders how Brexit affects that. One wonders how a change in the administration here in the United States, depending on what happens particularly in Congress, could affect President Obama's and the U.S. position. So I think all these things are somewhat tenuous. And so that just, I think, it makes an even greater case for vigilance and focus, and also ensuring that the things that we're talking about in these actual G8 statements and finance ministers actually are affecting the people on the ground in such a way that it's actually making their lives better and addressing the transition and the changes and the turmoil that in some cases result. And so those are just things that are on the top of my mind that might put some of this progress at risk.
Is it
If I
fair
could
to
just
say
say very quickly on that, and I fully agree with David, but I think that precisely, I'm glad how we both came in, because I think that precisely argues for the fact that we have to make a business case for why these agendas can be more cost effective and deliver greater results by coming together.
Is it fair to say that the
I think you had a follow-up question.
Yeah? Well, one sec, before we go to that, it seems like what we're really listening to this conversation and thinking about some of the ones we've had this week, is it fair to say that the days are gone when business could think about making money so that philanthropists could think about fixing problems, and that government could think simply about job creation and GDP growth when at stake, given population, at stake, given climate change, is the fundamental natural asset base on which the economy depends. And so we now have a far more complex life. We have a far more complex set of challenges in order to find what our new friend, the sophomore from Yale, said is this question of sustainability. We have to be much more purposeful as individuals, as CEOs, as investors, because it's not as simple as making the money one day and figuring out how to do good another.
Yeah, well, you've said it perfectly.
Any other questions here from this group? Yes, go ahead.
So I'll go again. We have a partnership with Brookings, and Bruce Katz, and we've set up something called a Center for Placemaking and Innovation. And that has sort of moved the idea of innovation from not just from tech and meds into cultural centers, into market districts, into various kinds of hubs. And by changing government to be more place-led or place-focused, not just place-based, but place-led, place-focused, with communities and with entrepreneurs, you can create a real resurgence in the kind of investment, entrepreneurship, and outcomes that have a massive impact on the growth of cities. Yeah. So the city-states, and Bruce's argument is that the city-states is where we're going to see most of the growth in the world in the future. But the countries are just not participating the way the cities are. They're the centers of activity. That's where things go on, and cities to cities to cities are where change can occur.
Yeah, my reaction to that is pardon me? Yeah, my reaction to that is I agree from what I know, and I think it's fabulous. So if you look at what's happening at the federal level, it's hard to hope that our solutions lie there without some fundamental change. And if you look at what's happening in many states, there was a book, I don't know, right about the time that President Clinton came into office, I'm forgetting the name, I think it was somebody from Brookings, Laboratories of Democracy, which was about the innovation that was taking place at the state levels in terms of all sorts of new program development and so forth. And that's now shifted to the cities. I lived through that in Pittsburgh. I lived in Pittsburgh for 10 years, and it was exactly as you described, where this incredible renaissance where local, public, philanthropy, and private capital, local CEOs came together. And you see that happening around the country in ways that's very inspiring.
So let's take time for one more question. Ann.
Thanks so much. This is for David. As a member of a previous Republican administration, you did allude to this, but I hate to see a whole panel go by without asking the Donald Trump question, and that is, for climate change, how will his positions, which I don't particularly understand on climate change, but how will that change all of the work and all of your things you're talking about?
Not to be glib, I have no idea. I mean, I honestly, I don't really know what his positions actually are, nor do I know whether they would stay there. So I think it's very hard, which is one of the sources of uncertainty, is knowing what that administration would look like if by chance it was elected. So it's very hard to say. It's an incredibly complex topic, as hopefully today's conversation has suggested. And so bringing the right quality of thinking with historical perspective and rigor to these questions is going to be critical, hopefully, for whoever becomes president, because there's been lots of progress made, but lots of room to continue.
So in summary, an environmentalist, a world banker, a hedge fund guy walk into a bar, and the punchline is, Donald Trump, I have no idea. So I want to thank the panelists, Paula and David. Thank all of you for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you.